The thing about interstellar expeditions, particularly the ones organized by committees composed of 17 different species who all needed to agree on font choices before approving mission parameters, was that they tended to overestimate their own brilliance. The Kethera 7 expedition was no exception to this rule. In fact, it might have been the gold standard of bureaucratic overconfidence, a shining example of what happens when you let logistics officers who've never left climate-controlled environments design survival protocols. The planet itself was gorgeous, all sweeping valleys and crystalline rivers that looked like someone had photoshopped them into existence. Perfect for a 3-week geological survey. The expedition crew of 42 beings from 12 species had packed enough supplies to last 2 months, all neatly organized in hovercrates that utilized anti-gravity technology so advanced it made quantum physics look like kindergarten mathematics. Everything was calculated, optimized, and backed up in triplicate, which made it particularly embarrassing when the river took everything. It happened on day 4, during what Commander Zeph had called a routine crossing. The hovercrates, magnificent pieces of engineering that they were, had exactly one design flaw that none of the 300-plus engineers who'd built them had considered. They worked brilliantly in vacuum atmospheric conditions and even underwater. But they had absolutely no protocol for what to do when submerged in a river with a current that moved like it had somewhere important to be. The water hit the gravitic stabilizers, which interfaced poorly with the mineral content that made Kethera 7's rivers sparkle so beautifully in photographs. Sparks flew, not metaphorical sparks of inspiration, but actual electrical discharge that lit up the water like a fireworks display. Then every single hovercrate decided that down was actually a very interesting direction and sank like stones that had been taking weight gain supplements. 42 beings stood on the riverbank, watching 2 months of supplies disappear around the bend. The silence was the kind that usually preceded either great innovation or complete civilizational collapse. The smart money was on the latter. Commander Zeph, whose species had conquered interstellar travel 3,000 years ago, stared at the water with the expression of someone watching their competence float away in real time. His scales, normally a confident purple, had faded to a sickly lavender that clashed terribly with his uniform. With Kresh, the insectoid engineer, whose compound eyes could perceive 17 different wavelengths of light, clicked his mandibles in the mathematical rhythm that meant he was calculating something unpleasant. After a moment, he announced in his translated voice that sounded like wind chimes having an anxiety attack. By my estimation, accounting for our metabolic requirements and the caloric density of emergency rations in our personal packs, we have enough food for 73 hours. The rescue window is not for 18 days. Valora, who existed primarily as a being of coherent energy contained in a vaguely humanoid field matrix, pulsed with distressed orange frequencies. Perhaps we could enter dormancy states. My species can survive extended periods without sustenance if we lower our vibrational frequency. Your species, yes, Zeph said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying very hard not to panic in front of subordinates. The rest of us need actual matter to convert into energy. Revolutionary concept, I know. This was when Marcus Webb, who had been standing slightly apart from the group with his hands in his pockets, spoke up for the first time since the disaster. We could eat. The silence that followed this statement was somehow louder than the previous one. Zeph turned slowly, his reptilian neck rotating with the deliberate movement of someone deciding whether to be hopeful or angry. Eat what? Exactly. The supplies are gone, unless you have a replicator hidden in your primitive clothing. Marcus, whose job title was officially listed as Primitive Survival Consultant, a position that had been mandated by the human government and mocked by literally everyone else on the expedition, gestured toward the river. Fish. More silence. Someone, probably Valora, made a confused humming sound. Fish, Thakresh repeated, like he was testing out a word in a foreign language. You propose we extract aquatic life forms from their habitat and consume them. Wild, I know, Marcus said, his face maintaining the expression of someone who had expected this exact scenario and was enjoying being right in the most unhelpful way possible. Completely unprecedented. Humans have only been doing it for about 200,000 years, give or take. The expedition team, composed of species who had mastered faster-than-light travel, genetic engineering, and the complete manipulation of local space-time, stared at the human like he had suggested they build a spacecraft out of tree bark and good intentions. Commander Zeph's scales shifted through several colors that didn't translate well but roughly meant processing unexpected information. You can acquire these fish. With what equipment? Our tools are in the crates. With my hands, Marcus said, then watched the collective comprehension fail to dawn. And some plants. Give me an hour. He walked away before anyone could argue, heading toward a stand of flexible reeds growing along the riverbank. Behind him, he heard Thakresh whisper to Valora, "He's going to weave a net, isn't he? I've read about this. It's adorably primitive." Marcus smiled to himself. Adorably primitive. Right up until adorably primitive was the only thing standing between them and starvation. The human had known this job would be exactly like this. When the Interstellar Exploration Council had added the Primitive Survival Consultant position to expedition rosters, it had been a political concession to humanity, a new species on the galactic stage that kept insisting their low-tech skills had value. The other species had treated it like humans asking to bring emotional support animals on starships, a cute cultural quirk to be tolerated with condescending patience. Marcus had sat through 17 different aliens explaining their species' mastery of technology. He'd nodded through lectures about energy-matter conversion and dimensional storage. He'd smiled politely when Thakresh had shown him a device the size of a fingernail that could scan, analyze, and replicate any organic compound in the known universe. And now that device was at the bottom of a river, and Marcus was gathering reeds. The reeds on Kethera 7 were similar enough to cattails back on Earth, flexible and strong with a fibrous interior that could be separated and woven. Marcus selected the longest ones, testing their strength with practiced hands. Around him, he could hear the expedition team arguing in 7 different languages about rescue protocols and emergency procedures, voices rising in the universal pitch of intelligent beings, discovering their intelligence had limits. He laid out the reeds in a pattern, began the over-under weaving that humans had been doing since before they'd invented the wheel. His fingers moved automatically, muscle memory from a childhood spent learning skills that his teachers had called quaint hobbies. Basket weaving, fire starting, tracking, fishing, all the arts that civilization had supposedly made obsolete. Except civilization, as it turned out, was just technology's fancy outfit, and the outfit had floated downstream. 20 minutes into weaving, Marcus acquired an audience. Thakresh approached first, his multiple legs moving with the careful hesitation of someone approaching either a miracle or a madness. "You are manually interlacing plant fibers," the insectoid observed, his translation device managing to convey fascination despite the mechanical voice. "The tensile strength of individual reeds is insufficient for catching fish, but the woven matrix distributes force across multiple connection points. Ingenious, in a brutally simple way." "Thanks, I think," Marcus said, not looking up from his work. The net was taking shape, A rough diamond pattern that would tighten under weight. Not pretty, but functional. Pretty didn't catch fish. More aliens gathered. Velora pulsed with curious yellow frequencies. A pair of Quellen, whose species resembled ambulatory ferns with too many opinions, whispered to each other in their rustling language. "How long will this take?" Commander Zeph asked, trying to sound authoritative but mostly sounding hungry. Reptilian metabolisms, for all their efficiency, still needed fuel. "I'm making 3 nets," Marcus said, tying off another section. "Figure another 30 minutes for all of them. Then we fish." "We fish," one of the Quellen repeated, the universal translator catching the bemused tone. "We, the crew of a Class 7 exploratory vessel, are going to fish like primitives." Marcus looked up, met the alien's cluster of eye stalks with his own decidedly less impressive 2 eyes. "You got a better idea?" "Because I'm all ears." "Well, 2 ears, but the expression stands." Silence greeted this, the kind of silence that acknowledged reality without being happy about it. "I could help," Thekrish offered, reaching toward the reeds with his complex manipulator appendages. Marcus considered this. The insectoid had 17 fingers across 4 limbs, each capable of independent fine motor control. On paper, he should be amazing at weaving. "Sure, watch how I'm doing the pattern and copy it on this section." What followed was a masterclass in how theoretical knowledge and practical skill were distant cousins who rarely spoke. Thekrish, whose species had built computers that could calculate faster than light could travel, struggled with the concept of over-under, his fingers tangled in the reeds. The pattern looked like a mathematical proof had gotten drunk and made bad decisions. "This is more complex than it appears," Thekrish admitted after 5 minutes of creating what could generously be called abstract art. "The spatial reasoning required is significant." "It's really not," Marcus said, gently taking the mangled section and unweaving it. "Your brain is overcomplicating it. It's just repetition." "Just repetition," the engineer echoed, sounding like someone discovering a foreign concept, which Marcus supposed it was. When your species had robots for everything, repetition became something you programmed, not something you did. The nets took 45 minutes total. 3 diamond weave nets, each about 6 feet long, with stones tied to one end for weight. Marcus tested each one, checking the weave tension, making small adjustments. The aliens watched like he was performing surgery. In a way, he supposed, he was. Surgery on their collective survival. "Right," Marcus said, standing and stretching his back. "Fishing time. Who wants to learn?" The enthusiasm was underwhelming. Eventually, Thekrish volunteered, along with Velora and a stocky dracon named Krev, whose species' idea of cuisine involved crystallized minerals. This was going to be interesting. The river flowed clear and fast, the water cold enough to make Marcus's hands ache as he waded in. He could see fish, silver shapes darting through the current. They looked similar to salmon, streamlined and quick. Good eating, if he could catch them. "The principle is simple," Marcus explained, positioning himself in the current. "Fish swim upstream. We position the nets downstream of where they're congregating, then drive them toward it. They hit the net, instinct makes them dive, and the net captures them." "Instinct," Velora hummed. "The fish have behavioral patterns we exploit." "Everything has behavioral patterns," Marcus said. "You just need to know what they are." He demonstrated, sweeping the net through the water in a smooth arc. The motion was harder than it looked, fighting the current while maintaining net tension. The first pass caught nothing. The second pass caught nothing. The third pass caught a fish that immediately thrashed so violently that Kresh stumbled backward with a startled click. "It's moving," the insectoid announced, like this was news. "It's alive." "Yeah," Marcus said, wading to shore with his catch. The fish was a good size, maybe 3 pounds, silver scales catching the light. He dispatched it quickly with a rock, ignoring the various gasps and distressed noises from his audience. "You terminated it." Valora pulsed, her field flickering with uncertain orange. "You extracted a living being from its environment and terminated it." Marcus looked at the energy being, then at the fish, then back. "Yes, that's generally how eating meat works." "Did you think it volunteered?" "My species has not consumed physical matter in 15,000 years, Valora said, her tone suggesting she was reconsidering some life choices. "This is disturbing. Your species also isn't going to starve in 15 days, Marcus pointed out, moving back into the water. "Evolution's funny like that. Some of us still need the messy bits." He caught 3 more fish in the next 20 minutes, the technique coming back like he'd never left Earth's rivers. Licorice attempted to help, and mostly succeeded in tangling his limbs in the net. Krev, surprisingly, took to it quickly, his sturdy build good for bracing against the current. By the time the sun started dropping toward the horizon, they had 17 fish laid out on the bank. 17 silver bodies that represented the difference between survival and desperation. The expedition team gathered around, staring at the catch with expressions ranging from relief to horror to confused fascination. "This is food?" one of the Quellin asked, prodding a fish with a tendril. "This quantity can sustain us." "This is day 1, Marcus said. "Rivers full of them. We can catch more tomorrow, and the next day. However long we need." Commander Zeph's scales had shifted back toward purple, relief obvious in his posture. "You have, quite literally, saved this expedition, Marcus Webb. I admit I doubted the value of your position." "Most people do," Marcus said, gathering dry wood from the tree line. "Right up until they need it." "What are you doing now?" Licorice asked, watching Marcus arrange branches in a cone shape. "Starting a fire." The silence was becoming a pattern. "With what ignition source?" the engineer asked. "Your fire-starting tools were in your pack, which was in a crate, which is currently being a habitat for aquatic life." Marcus picked up 2 pieces of dry wood and began rubbing them together with the bow drill method, using a curved branch and some plant fiber he'd prepared earlier. The friction started generating heat, smoke beginning to curl from the point of contact. "That's impossible," Licorice stated, which was unfortunate timing, because flames chose that moment to catch. Marcus transferred the ember to his tinder bundle, blew gently, and watched fire spread through the dry grass and twigs. He fed it larger pieces, building the flame until he had a proper campfire crackling in the gathered dusk. The expedition team stared at the fire like it was performing magic, which, from their perspective, maybe it was. Technology could be indistinguishable from magic, but apparently the reverse was also true. Primitive skills looked like sorcery to beings who'd forgotten them entirely. "He created combustion through friction," someone whispered. "Just friction and plant material." "Humans are terrifying," another voice added. Marcus, who had heard variations of this his entire career, just smiled and started preparing the fish. He'd brought a knife in his boot, a habit that had earned him mockery during the expedition briefings. Nobody was mocking now. Cleaning fish was an art form that Marcus had learned from his grandfather, who'd learned it from his grandfather, a chain of knowledge stretching back through generations. Each cut precise, removing guts and scales, preparing the meat for cooking. Around him, aliens watched with varying degrees of nausea and fascination. "The internal organs are discarded?" Krev asked, watching Marcus work. "That's wasteful. You want to eat fish intestines? Be my guest," Marcus said. "Me? I prefer the parts that don't taste like river bottom. He set up rocks around the fire, creating a makeshift grill, and laid the first fish across the heated stones. The smell hit immediately, sizzling protein and wood smoke, a scent that was probably hardwired into human DNA as meaning safety and food and survival. The aliens reacted like he'd released a chemical weapon. "What is that smell?" Valora pulsed, her field turning a distressed purple. "It's affecting my sensory receptors." "That's cooking," Marcus said, flipping the fish. "You'll get used to it." "Will we?" she asked, not sounding convinced. But hunger, as it turned out, was a powerful motivator. As Marcus cooked fish after fish, experimenting with different techniques for different alien biologies, the expedition team crept closer to the fire. The light and heat drew them in, ancient instincts responding to flames even if their conscious minds found the whole thing primitive. The first taste tests were comedy gold. Krish approached his portion like it might attack him, analyzing it with 3 different scanning devices, before finally putting a small piece in his mandibles. His antenna shot straight up. He paused, processing. "This is actually acceptable. The protein chains are compatible with my biology, and the thermal processing has enhanced flavor compounds. I am consuming dead aquatic life and enjoying it. My hive mothers would be appalled." Krev demolished his portion in seconds and asked for more. The Quellin required Marcus to cook theirs until it was basically charcoal, but they ate it. Even Valora, who didn't need physical food, hovered near the fire with something that looked like curiosity. As more aliens ate, the camp transformed. The panic that had dominated the afternoon faded, replaced by the warm contentment of full stomachs. Beings who'd been calculating their mortality hours ago now sat in loose circles, talking and joking with the ease that only comes after disaster is avoided. Commander Zeph settled down near Marcus, accepting another piece of fish with what might have been gratitude or resignation, possibly both. "I need to apologize," the reptilian said, his voice lower now, meant for just the 2 of them. "When the human government insisted on including your position in expeditions, I thought it was political theater. A species new to the stars, trying to assert relevance." "It was political theater," Marcus said, feeding the fire. "Doesn't mean it wasn't also practical. We've become dependent on our technology," Zeph continued, staring into the flames. "To the point where losing it means losing our ability to survive. That's not advancement. That's vulnerability masquerading as progress." Marcus turned a fish, watching the skin crisp and char. "Technology's fine. Technology's great. But it's a tool, not a replacement for knowledge. Your species mastered interstellar travel, which is incredible. Humans are still figuring that out. But we never forgot how to survive when the tools break." "Because you couldn't," Kresh added, joining their conversation. The engineer had positioned himself near the fire, his exoskeleton appreciating the warmth. "Humanity developed technology slowly enough that the old skills remained relevant. We leapfrogged straight from basic tool use to advanced computing. We never had the intermediate phase where both existed simultaneously. So we're accidentally prepared for disaster through historical accident," Marcus said. "Great survival strategy." "Yet here we are," Zeph said, gesturing at the camp, at the fire, at the fed and safe expedition team. "Alive because of historical accident. The irony is substantial." The fire crackled, sparks drifting into the darkening sky. Above them, stars began appearing, including the distant point of light that was their orbiting ship, waiting for a pickup that wouldn't come for days. The ship had supplies, climate control, comfortable beds, everything civilization promised. Down here they had fire and fish, and the growing understanding that maybe civilization was more fragile than they'd realized. Valora drifted closer, her energy field pulsing with contemplative blue. Marcus Webb, I must ask, do humans learn these skills as children? Is this common knowledge? Some humans, Marcus said. Most don't need it anymore. We've got cities and supply chains and technology that works better than mine. But some of us learn anyway. Call it insurance. Call it nostalgia. Call it connecting with something older than civilization. My people have records of our primitive past, she said softly. 10 million years ago we existed as chemical beings, physical like you. We transcended that form, became pure energy, considered it evolution's ultimate achievement. She paused, her field flickering. But watching you tonight, I wonder what we lost in the transcending, the knowledge, the skills, the connection to simple survival. We gained efficiency. Did we lose resilience? Can't answer that, Marcus said. But I can tell you that knowing how to start a fire and catch a fish, that knowledge has survived every apocalypse, every disaster, every moment when civilization failed. It's the baseline. Everything else is extra. Krev, who'd been listening while working on his third helping of fish, rumbled his agreement. On my homeworld we have a saying, the mountain cares nothing for your degrees, meaning nature is indifferent to sophistication. It only cares if you can survive it. Earth has the same concept, Marcus said. Different words, same truth. The expedition team had formed a full circle around the fire now, drawn by light and warmth, and the simple human pleasure of gathering together after hardship. They came from 12 different worlds, evolved under different stars, developed entirely separate paths to consciousness and civilization. But here, around a primitive fire eating primitive food, they found common ground in the universal experience of survival. Commander Zeph stood, his scales catching firelight in patterns that signified formal address. When we return to the Council, I'm recommending major changes to expedition protocols, mandatory primitive survival training for all crew members, multiple redundancies for supply systems, and he looked directly at Marcus, a permanent primitive survival consultant position on every long-term expedition, with full authority to override technological solutions when practical alternatives exist. The Council will resist, Thikresh predicted. They'll argue that technology makes such measures obsolete. Then the Council can explain to the families of lost expedition members why their loved ones starved next to rivers full of fish, Zeph said flatly. Because they never learned to weave a net. Marcus poked the fire, sending up another shower of sparks. Appreciate the support, Commander. Though I should mention that primitive survival consultant is a terrible job title. Makes me sound like I'm teaching cave painting. What would you prefer? Valora asked. Resilience specialist, Marcus said, because that's what it is. Teaching resilience. How to adapt when the plan fails, how to survive when the tools break, how to remember that we're all still biological entities who need food and water and shelter, no matter how advanced our starships get. Resilience specialist, Zeph repeated, testing the words. I like it. It acknowledges sophistication while respecting practicality. Very diplomatic. I have my moments, Marcus said. The night deepened, the fire burning steady, and one by one the expedition members settled into sleep. They had no tents, no climate-controlled sleeping pods, no automated environmental systems, just the ground and the fire, and the knowledge that they'd survived the day. Marcus took first watch, feeding the flames and listening to the river. Tomorrow would bring more fishing, more teaching, more learning for beings who'd thought they were beyond such things. Eventually the rescue ship would arrive, and they'd return to civilization with its comforts and technologies and complex supply chains. But they'd return changed. They'd carry the knowledge that sophistication was no substitute for adaptability, that progress without resilience was just elaborate fragility. And maybe, just maybe, the galaxy would learn something from a human with dirty hands and ancient skills, sitting by firelight and keeping his people fed. The river flowed past, indifferent to their struggles, carrying away the supplies that represented their civilization. But the fish swam through it, the reeds grew beside it, and the human had turned both into survival. Pretty good trade-off, all things considered. When the rescue ship arrived 18 days later, as scheduled and completely unaware of the crisis their expedition had faced, they found a curious scene. The team was healthy, well-fed, and gathered around morning cooking fires. Marcus was teaching an advanced nets and traps course to 12 enthusiastic students. Someone had built what looked like a smokehouse. Fish hung drying in the sun, preserved for future use. The rescue captain, a Quellan named Vesh, whose experience with expeditions led him to expect disaster and desperation, stared at the organized camp with visible confusion. "Commander Zeph, we're prepared for emergency extraction. What is your status?" Zeph, whose scales had maintained a healthy purple throughout the extended stay, smiled with far too many teeth. "Status is excellent, Captain. We lost our supplies in a river incident on day 4. We've been managing fine." "Managing," Vesh repeated, his eye stalks swiveling to take in the camp. "With what resources?" "Fish mostly," Thikresh supplied helpfully, holding up a woven basket that contained his morning catch. "Also root vegetables from the forest, some berries Marcus identified as safe, and one memorable evening of roasted tree bark that was surprisingly acceptable." The captain's translator device made a sound that might have been confusion, might have been a system error. "You survived 18 days on primitive foraging and fishing," Marcus added from his position by the fire, where he was teaching Krev the finer points of cooking temperature control. "Don't forget the fishing. Fishing's important." Captain Vesh looked at Marcus, then at the camp, then at his rescue ship with its emergency supplies and medical equipment and crisis protocols, all prepared for a disaster that hadn't happened. "You're the human," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Last time I checked," Marcus confirmed. "Of course you are," Vesh said, and something in his tone suggested he'd heard stories about humans, about their tendency to survive things that should have killed them through sheer stubborn adaptability. Of course the human kept everyone alive with plants and river fish. Why did I expect anything different? "To be fair," Commander Zeph said, walking over to clasp Vesh's shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie, "we all expected something different. We expected to die. Then we remembered we had a human, and humans are apparently allergic to dying when alternatives exist." "It's less dramatic than it sounds," Marcus said, though his smile suggested he was enjoying this more than he'd admit. "Really just basic survival skills. Any human could have done it." "Any human," Thikresh agreed. "Which is precisely the problem. What we consider ancient history, humans consider common sense. What we view as primitive, humans view as practical. There are species that walked to the stars but remembered to pack matches." The captain stood silent for a moment, processing this. Then, in a tone of someone who'd just understood something profound, he said, "The Council is going to hate your report." "The Council," Commander Zeph said with deeply satisfied malice, "can be educated. Or they can keep sending expeditions out with single-point failure systems and hope they never encounter a river." Marcus, still teaching his cooking class, didn't look up. He just smiled into the fire, knowing that he'd done exactly what his job title had promised. He'd kept people alive using knowledge that was older than civilization, in a galaxy that had forgotten such knowledge could still matter. And somewhere, probably, the river was still flowing, still full of fish, still completely indifferent to the difference between primitive and advanced, which when you thought about it was exactly the point.